Hi there. I'm going to share a sermon that I prepared for Sunday, which was the second Sunday of Easter. The readings are from Revelation chapter 1, verse 4 to 8, and from John's Gospel, chapter 20, verse 19 to 31. So feel free to pause the video, have a read of those, and then start it up again. We've had a look at the introduction, or a little bit of the introduction to the book of Revelation, and I'm wondering about how you felt about reading Revelation. Wonder what is your impression of that book, because there's a lot of different sort of ideas about what the book of Revelation is in the church and in the wider community. A lot of the time people have said that it's talking about our future. Sometimes they've pointed to things in the book of Revelation and said, oh, that's the Soviet Union, or that's the United States, or that's the Pope. That's not really what the book of Revelation is. It's not telling us about our future. It's a book that came out of the ancient church at a time when they had been experiencing persecution. And so it was a book that was trying to offer hope to them in that situation in the Roman Empire. They didn't need to know about things that were going to be happening in the 20th century or the 21st century. So it's not going to be telling them about the United States or about Russia or about any of those modern nation states. It's really all about things that were going on for the ancient church in the Roman Empire. Like I was saying, they'd been experiencing persecution. My understanding is that it usually wasn't systematic persecution, but at particular times, Christians were being deliberately persecuted. Like after the fire of Rome, the Emperor Nero, blamed the disaster on Christians and executed Christians as punishment. At other times, things that the Romans did just made things difficult for Christians because everybody was expected to worship the Roman emperor as a god. This was a way of trying to unify the empire because they were from all different nations and languages and faiths. But it caused a problem for Christians because we believe in only worshipping one God, like Jews and Muslims do. So we can't worship an emperor, we can't worship a king or a prime minister or a president. So they refused to worship the emperor, and often that would mean that they were persecuted. And it would also just mean that they were isolated from the people around them who did choose to participate in those rituals and didn't have a problem with it. When we read Revelation, it might sound like it's talking about things that are happening in the world now. And that's really just because human nature doesn't change that much. It hasn't changed that much in a couple of thousand years. The way that empires operate today is pretty similar to how they did in the ancient world. They still try to control people in pretty similar ways. Even though the technology has changed, the kind of things that empires are trying to do, pretty similar. We need to be careful that we don't end up just looking at other world powers and saying that that's where we see the evil empire of Revelation. We shouldn't just be looking at the United States or Russia or the EU or whoever it is and saying that's the evil empire, because we might just not be recognizing the ways that we ourselves are part of the same kinds of systems in Australia or in the church. Because things were different for the ancient Christians under the Roman Empire, because things were difficult for ancient Christians under the Roman Empire, we have them talking about a different reality, a reality where Jesus, the one who's been killed by their rulers, is king. And they hope for a time when he's going to return as king and renew the world and lead people in his way. Revelation doesn't talk about Christians being whisked away into heaven. It talks about Christ coming to earth, and it talks about the holy city of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven and the earth welcoming it and being renewed. It's a vision of hope that's very physical and corporeal. It's the hope of the world being renewed and humanity being renewed. It's not the hope of escaping from the physical world into a spiritual paradise. And this introduction that we've had a look at, it talks about Jesus as the firstborn of the dead. It's like his grave has become a womb that he's been reborn from. And so the Christian hope has become hope of resurrection. It's not just hope of continuing on in a spiritual heaven as a soul with no body. It's the hope of being resurrected with a body in a renewed earth. Because the sense in the Jewish worldview that Christianity came from was that the body and physicality and the earth are not bad things to be escaped. The creation is good, and it's good to live and to do the things that human beings do. To work and make food and eat and drink and dance and fall in love and make love and have children and play and sing. In Greek and Roman societies, they had more of a sense that the body and the physical world are things to escape because they're dirty and bodies leak and they experience weakness and pain and decline and they bring us into shame. And these ideas have come into the way that the church has thought and the way that our society has thought about bodies and physicality, but they aren't the attitude that we generally find in the scripture. And we can see that in the gospel reading where we have another encounter with the resurrected Jesus. It says that Jesus turns up in the closed room with them and he says, "Peace." And that's important because they were afraid of people getting into the room with them. That's why they had the doors locked, because they're worried that the leaders are going to come and get them the same way that they got their teacher. And so he arrives and he says, "Peace." He reassures them. He reassures them like we reassure each other when we gather to worship, when we share the peace with each other. But he's gotten into the room with them. That might be a bit of a surprise. Seems like he's doing a kind of a ghostly type thing. But he has a physical body still bearing the wounds of his execution. And he invites them to examine the wounds that human beings have inflicted on him. This is strange and spooky and unbelievable. And he says that he's sending them in the same way that his Father, the Creator, sent him. He's been sent by his Father to reconcile with humanity. And now he's sending them on a continuation of the same mission. And he's saying that they can offer forgiveness or withhold it. He's saying that even as he's showing them the wounds that human beings have inflicted on him, on his hands and on his side. And it makes me think, what is more unbelievable? Resurrection, or the fact that the resurrected victim is preaching forgiveness? And we're told that the disciple Thomas was not there, and so he doesn't believe when the others tell him that they've seen Christ resurrected. Often preachers have given him a hard time. They've said that he's a doubter because he needed to see to believe. But we have to remember the other disciples, they needed to see to believe as well. And I wonder, does he not believe in the resurrection? Or does he not believe in a resurrected Christ preaching forgiveness, following what he's gone through at the hands of his enemies? When he does see, it seems that seeing is enough, because we aren't told that he touches the wounds. It's just left there hanging. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who've not seen and have believed." And when he says that, he's talking about people who come later, the people who come to faith because they've heard the stories told or because they've read them in a letter or in a gospel. He's talking about people like us who've not seen and have come to faith in the resurrected Christ and in his message of forgiveness. But it might be difficult for us who've not seen the resurrected Christ if we're the kind of people who need to see and feel for ourselves. But I think we might be able to find evidence of this if we spend some more time sitting with the story and contemplating it. Possibly the most unbelievable part of the story is that the risen Christ is preaching forgiveness after being cruelly and unfairly executed by his enemies. And we may not have the corporeal Jesus in the room with us, calling us to forgiveness and asking us to touch his wounds, but we have something like it. Since it has just recently been Anzac Day, the day when we remember members of the Australian and New Zealand armies who fought in the First World War, and as we remember other soldiers and other service people who've fought in wars in Australia, we're reminded of the conflicts that we've had in the past. And I'm reminded of how many of our enemies have actually become friends. Many Turkish and German and Italian and Vietnamese and Afghan people, all countries that we've previously gone to war with, have become part of our community and are now our neighbours and our friends. And Japan, who we've previously gone to war with, is now a close ally, important trading partner. We're now friends and allies when we were enemies. But the most profound evidence of the risen Christ's forgiveness, I think, comes from the soil of this place. Because for a long time, we colonist and migrant people, like myself, have had First Peoples reaching out to us, offering forgiveness. From soon after colonisation, there were Aboriginal people reaching out to colonists saying they'd like to make a treaty to work out how we can settle our conflict and live in the land together, despite the harm that they've received from colonists like myself. Not everybody, but there've been people who have been doing that. And it's happening at the moment in Victoria. It's being negotiated. That's the wounded offering forgiveness, calling us to a different way. And part of that process includes truth-telling, making space to hear all accounts of what has happened in the conflict so that the whole story is understood and recognised and accepted by the community. It's a bit like Jesus offering to show us his wounds so that we can understand and recognise what humanity has put him through. In the church that I'm part of, in the Uniting Church, we've had the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress reach out to us saying that they want to walk together with us as First and Second Peoples, even though the church was part of the process of displacing people. And even though the church was part of the process of splitting up families and alienating people from their culture, from their language, from their faith. That's the wounded offering forgiveness, calling us to a different way. White churches brought the gospel to those people, but now those people are offering the gospel back to us, challenging us to follow the way of Jesus, the way of forgiveness. That's the wounded reminding us of the way of Jesus. And we've had Indigenous people asking for a voice to Parliament so that they can talk to us about the things that matter most to them. That's again seeking a relationship when we've been enemies. Part of that is because our law is locking up young Indigenous folks at really high rates. That's the wounded offering forgiveness, calling us to a different way. This is a very real way that we're being offered forgiveness and the opportunity to change direction, walk together like Jesus describes. Forgiveness is not just something disembodied and purely spiritual. It has the potential to mean very real things for how we treat the land and its creatures and each other's bodies.